Hey everyone, welcome to a special bonus edition of the Rochford Files. Here with your host, Andrew Rochford, coming to you from the Mile Highland City. Shout out to Bones Highland for somehow making NBA All Rookie second team. That was a bit of a surprise, but not quite as much of a shock as the fact that Tim Connolly may be looking to leave the Nuggets organization. Not really something to get too in depth on for this show. I've already got a lot lined up for tonight, as this is live from the garden of YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. So last night, I noticed last night into today, a lot of news came up, a lot of topics came up that uh, felt very useful to do a bonus stream for, because I kept last night's stream with Uncle Warren pretty simple. One main central topic with that Buffalo shooter thing that happened over the weekend. And we pretty much took that shit to 2 hours. And now I figured after all this progressive elections shit that happened last night, that means people like me need to set the record straight on some of these candidates and make sure they know the truth about, because otherwise that's just going to be a new crop of people to get their hopes on. But before we get into some of those progressives that won their primaries last night, we got to start with a different story first. And this one is going to be in relation to the Disinformation Board getting paused. That was some pretty good news to see coming up on the Twitters earlier this afternoon. So let's get right into that article from the Washington Post, which somehow decided this was important enough to not be paywalled. And this is from another scummy journalist who is very much in lockstead with the idea of this disinformation board. You know, this Taylor Lorenz, she got extremely triggered following the complaints from that libs of TikTok for being after she did the doxing. But let's just get right on to this. On the morning of April 27th, the Department of Homeland Security announced the creation of the first Disinformation Governance Board with the stated goal to coordinate countering misinformation related to Homeland Security. The Biden administration tapped Nina Jankowicz, a well-known figure in the field of fighting disinformation and extremism, as the board's executive director. So, if she's such a disinformation fighter, why did people who disagree with her, uh, how come she let herself get defeated by those people if she's such a fighter? And naming the 33-year-old Jinkowitz to run the newly created board, the administration chose someone with extensive experience in the field of disinformation, which has emerged as an urgent and important issue. The author of the books How to Be a Woman Online and How to Lose the Information War, and what she's doing right now is losing because she cannot stand on her own merits. Her career also featured stints at multiple nonpartisan think tanks and nonprofits, and included work that focused on strengthening democratic institutions. Within the small community of disinformation researchers, her work was well regarded. So, essentially, what she did is she hopped on board the Russia Gate gravy train. That's what she, especially after the Trump election, not exactly a nonpartisan effort, do you think? Then, when you're part of strengthening democratic institutions in the United States, what you're really for is weakening the real actual ones that exist all over the world, the global south, the Middle East, places which have more of a democracy than what you see here in the United States. But within hours of her new appointment, Jinkowitz was thrust into the spotlight by the very forces she dedicated her career to combating. The board itself and DHS received criticism for both its somewhat ominous name and scant details of specific mission. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said it could have done a better job of communicating what it is and what it isn't. Uh, to be honest, Mayor Alejandro, I don't think it mattered what you changed because it was pretty clear the bullshit that this was trying to sell, and there was no way of dressing it up nicer than what already was attempted. But Jankowicz was on the receiving end of the harshest attacks, with her role mischaracterized as she became a primary target on the right wing internet. She has been subject to an unrelenting barrage of harassment and abuse, while unchecked misrepresentations of her work continue to go viral. And this is the part I'm most upset with because there's a there's this shitlib universe, the one that the people like Tara Lorenz exist on, and many of these other blue checks, your big newspaper writers, and they don't even think the left exists beyond being liberal because there's a shit ton of lefties out there who are uh, coming out against this disinformation board, and most likely, in certain instances, a stronger way than what is characterized as being an exclusively a right wing pushback. Now, just 3 weeks after its announcement, this Information Governance Board is being paused, according to multiple employees at DHS, capping a back and forth week of decisions that change during the course of reporting of the story. On Monday, DHS decided to shut down the board, according to multiple people with the knowledge of the situation. By Tuesday morning, Jinkowitz had drafted a resignation letter in response to the board's dissolution. So this pretty much means she wasn't up to task for trying to stay committed to this weak ass idea, which was really just absolute garbage. And we know that whenever they push for censorship, it's always going to affect the actual left more and not the right that they claim it will protect the liberals against. Hey, WCSN, good to see you're here for another night. By Tuesday night, Jinkowitz was pulled into an urgent call with DHS officials who gave her the choice to stay on, even as the department's work was put on hold because of the backlash it faced. According to multiple people with knowledge of the call, working groups within the DHS focused on mis, dis, and malinformation have been suspended. The board could still be shut down pending a review from Homeland Security Advisory Council. On Wednesday morning, Jankowicz officially resigned from her role within the department. So, you remember last week with that viral moment? Yeah, that's right. Kelly. Good to see you here. Poor, scary poopits. When Rand Paul had that moment on the Senate where he pretty much called out the liberals for thinking that people aren't capable of being able to decide for themselves what is and what isn't misinformation. And that was a pretty true moment from him. At least that quote. Nina Jinkowitz has been subjected to unjustified and vile personal attacks and physical threats, a DSS spokesperson told the Washington Post in a statement. In congressional hearings and in media interviews, the secretary has repeatedly defended her as eminently qualified and underscored the importance of the department's disinformation work, and he will continue to do so. I'm not sure that she's really qualified for this. I mean, what's her real talent? Making shitty TikTok videos that bleed the ears of the masses and make people suffer from massive cringe in the process? Because that was her real talent, not this careerist opportunist spiel that she did along the side. Jinkowitz has not spoken publicly about her position since the day it was announced. Jinkowitz's experience as a prime example of how the right-wing internet apparatus operates, where far-right influencers attempt to identify a target, present a narrative, then repeat mischaracterizations across social media and websites with the aim of discrediting and attacking anyone who seeks to challenge them. It also shows what happens when institutions, when confronted with these attacks, don't respond effectively. So I'm guessing Jimmy Dore, Max Blumenthal, Kurt Metzger, the members of Revolutionary Blackout Network, Aaron Mate, Danny Haifong, Benjamin Norton. Those are all right wingers now. Myself. Are we all right wingers? Because that's certainly what your Taylor Lorenz is trying to frame here. Me Erdal. Oh, thanks for that. That's one word I haven't thought about learning in Spanish just yet. Those familiar with the board's inner workings, including DHS employees and Capitol Hill staffers, along with experts on disinformation, say Jinkowitz was set up to fail by an administration that was unsure of its messaging and unprepared to counteract a coordinated online campaign against her. Notice how it's always, when it comes to the women they want to push in this administration to get through, I mean, that other woman, Nanda Tyrion, you notice how it's always a fault of the administration and blame of the right wing when they fail to push push them through to the first choice of position, and it's not on them, their failures individually, because I think they've also tried to push some males into some certain positions. I don't think they've had a male fail yet, other than Rahm Emanuel. But you notice when the first thing that they try to push Rahm Emanuel for, they didn't blame the administration for not doing a better job of trying to protect him from failure. They allowed him to take the blame for it until they uh, put him into a different position. So that's one thing to point out with this Biden administration and how they look to protect women for failure. But with that Rahm Emanuel example, they didn't. blame the administration for not helping him enough. They just allowed that to sink on its own merits. Who fucking knows, Kelly? Whoever it was absolutely garbage. A disastrous roar. Just hours after Jinkowitz tweeted about her new job, far-right influencer Jack Posobiec posted tweets accusing the Biden administration of creating a Ministry of Truth. Posobiec's 1.7 million followers quickly sprung into action. By the end of the day, there were at least 53,235 posts on Twitter mentioning Disinformation Governance Board, many referencing Jankowicz by name, according to a report by Advanced Democracy, nonpartisan nonprofit organization. That's a lie, by the way, that conducts public interest research in the days following. That number skyrocketed. And how about adding all the tweets from some of the other people I just previously mentioned? Maybe add in other people like Garland Nixon, Tara Reid. There's several other people on the left that you can add, and I'm sure we can at least equal that easily and eclipse it compared to this one popular right winger, Jack Posobiec. The board was created to study best practices in combating the harmful effects of disinformation to help DHS counter viral lies and propaganda that could threaten domestic security, more like countering people who challenge back to their own viral lies and propaganda. Unlike the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984 that became a derogatory comparison point, neither the board nor Jinkowitz had any power or ability to declare what is true or false or compel internet providers, social media platforms, or public schools to take action against certain types of speech. In fact, the board itself had no power or authority to make any operational decisions. You really think that this government that's already right in hand with big tech hasn't came up with ways to further clamp down the same one that pretty much effectively had to push deep that effectively deplatformed RT America. Not only there, but it happened in many of the other NATO countries as well. So that is uh, the no authority argument that you're going to make for a Biden administration that has been uh, working to clamp down on this, as many of the top figures have been screaming about disinformation ever so often. Oh, Kelly, like the administration pushing Neera Tanden on us, and when she was universally rebuked, they gave her a cushy job. Exactly. And in that instance, they just characterized it also as being exclusively a right wing attack, which is absolutely untrue. The board's purpose has been grossly mischaracterized. It will not police speech, the DSA spokesperson said. Quite the opposite. Its focus is to ensure the freedom of speech is protected. Yep, weird flex right there because, you know, we many of us on YouTube would not be fighting against algorithm where many of us could have nearly 6 times as many subscribers as we have now. I mean, Harlan's Media, for example, they're stuck in like the lower 40,000s or very close to 40,000 on YouTube. And they had estimations that say that if YouTube algorithm didn't exist to keep the channel suppressed, that they'd be over 300,000 subscribers. So think about that. Then think about a Revolutionary Blackout Network. they would be at like maybe over 100,000 subscribers if you went by that logic. And I think that's reasonable to use on many of the channels that aren't even at 100,000 right. I mean, once you get higher, I don't think the suppression makes quite the difference. I think maybe a couple of 100,000 or so for the channels that are around the 1 million mark. Yes, WCN, that is a very interesting question that you have posed. And I imagine that total is very low, even among the people who support independent media like us. Posobiec's early tweets shaped the narrative, and Jingowitz was positioned as the primary target. Republican lawmakers echoed Posobiec's framing and amplified it to their audiences. Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt, who is a U.S. Senate hopeful, and Representative Andrew S. Clyde, both posted tweets similar to Posobiec's. Former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard also posted a video repeating Posobiec's statements. The week following the announcement, approximately 70% of Fox News' one-hour segments mentioned either Jingowitz or the board, with correspondents frequently deriding the board as a ministry of truth, according to Advanced Democracy. Fox News coverage was referenced in some of the most popular posts on Facebook and Twitter criticizing Jingowitz. And that, once again, is another issue with framing it as exclusively a right wing, because if you actually go to left wing independent media, like many of the channels that I've mentioned, you would notice that we wouldn't be spending 70% of our time talking about this, but an ample amount of time on this recent Ministry of Truth stuff, that you would get, you would hear the truth on so much more, like uh, hearing better takes on this U.S. Ukraine proxy war with Russia, uh, about to get more into Somalia soon, Yemen, Afghanistan. Because if there's one issue with right wing media, is they get very singularly focused on things, while on the left, you we get a lot, we cover a lot more shit. Lee Camp does have he does look like a good fit for the face of a disinformation ministry. Like, I mean, you remember when the Undertaker had the ministry stable in the late 90s? I think Lee Camp would have fit great as a character in that Undertaker's ministry, because with the look and the long hair, he he was the exact type of guy who just fit the image of that group. When you look at some of the other members like Gideon, Bradshaw, and Farouk, Gangrel, I believe was also in the Undertaker's ministry, and for a short time that was, I felt like that ministry taker was too short lived, because I think that was some of the Undertaker's best character work that he had in his career. Anyhow, so it was unfortunate that an injury cut that short. Then he pretty much came back as American Badass Taker. But not to get off on a tangent, but I always thought like Lee Camp, always with that long hair, had a look that would fit the ministry. Dozens of websites, including Breitbart, the Post Millennial, the Daily Caller, and New York Post, began mining Jingowitz's past social media posts and publishing articles to generate controversy. Some were simply mocking or making fun of her for parroting a song from Mary Poppins, Mary the Poopins. to talk about misinformation. In another instance, a performance where Jinkowitz sings a popular musical theater song about a person's desire to become rich and powerful, and was misrepresented simply to imply that Jinkowitz herself was after money and power and would sleep with men to get it. Oh. As this online campaign played out, DHS and Biden administration struggled to counter the repeated attacks. If there's anything about the Biden administration is they can't effectively counter anything from the right or left, which means they're just useless for anything other than the right. The weekend after her hiring announced, Mayorkas attempted to clarify the board's mission, which was a pretty futile and pointless effort, and defended Jankowicz's credentials. He did a round of TV news interviews, cringeworthy, intensified about the board during House and Senate committee hearings. A forceful defense of Jankowicz was noticeably absent online, where the attacks against her were concentrated. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki debunked false claims about the board during two news briefings and touted Jankowicz as an expert on online disinformation, but had little effect on her growing campaign against her. As usual, anything that the Biden administration really would like to do is pretty damn ineffective, other than make conditions worse for the people that are suckered into voting blue no matter who. You know what was funny about that is, Kelly, I heard when this originally got posted that it originally was behind the paywall, but shortly after they uh, uh, took it off the paywall. These smears leveled by bad faith, there's a good bad faith, like people who like the Bad Faith podcast by Brianna Joy Gray. I consider that's a good example of bad faith, and that really just means bad faith, uh, good left wing actors, but right wing actors against a deeply qualified expert and against efforts to better combat human smuggling and domestic terrorism are disgusting. White House Press Secretary Andrew Bates told on Tuesday. Uh, you know, what's disgusting is thinking that the only way you're going to beat that is with just continuing to grow the police force, deciding that people don't need the leftover COVID money, and deciding to try to grow the police when the police are just really a tool in society, forced to keep the working class by and large in its place. That's what I find disgusting when there's real social spending programs, which would be a better form of uh, keeping people safer. And if there's people who are terrorists, it's the people in charge of the military industrial complex, the people who are complicit to that, the same ones who reacted to a Somalian election and decided to put more boots on the ground. That those are terrorist-like actions. In addition to trying to give $40 billion to Ukrainian Nazis, is that not a terrorist action? Yet you try to weakly decry this the same when it happens in Buffalo. That inconsistency is staggering. WCSN designed to be as ineffective as the entire. Oh, you're so right about that. Same here. Same here. As she endured the attacks, Jingowitz was told to stay silent. After attempting to defend herself on Twitter April 27th, she was told by DHS officials not to issue any further public statements, according to multiple people close to her. So that meant uh, don't try to post any shitty singing TikTok videos because you have no chance of getting genuine adulation. Democratic lawmakers, legislative staff, and other administration employees who sought to defend Jingowitz were caught flat-footed. Administration officials did not brief the relevant congressional staff and committees ahead of the board's launch, and members of the congressional who had expressed interest in disinformation weren't given a detailed explanation about how it would operate. A fact sheet released by DHS on May 2nd did nothing to quell the outrage that had been building on the internet, nor did it clarify much of what the board would actually be doing or Jingowitz's role in it. See how it goes back to that recent ineffectiveness that WCSN referenced, because even if they did try to be more effective, I think it would be futile and pointless. Is there anything else worth it? You know, I think I'm going to skip down to this last section. A textbook disinformation campaign. Experts say that right wing disinformation and smear campaigns rarely follow the same playbook that is crucial that the public and leaders of institutions, especially in the government and media and the educational bodies, understand more fully how these cycles operate. Are any of you familiar with the shit lid disinformation and smear campaigns that regularly follow the same playbook, and that it's crucial that the public and leaders of institutions, especially in the government and the media and educational bodies, understand more fully how these cycles operate? The same ones that the shit lid disinformation trolls use against even a lot of these progressives, which I'm about to be roast and be critical of, the ones that had just won some primaries last night. You, I'm about to go in on that soon. The campaigns invariably start with identifying a person to characterize as a villain. Surprisingly, that happens all the time with all these progressive candidates that try to break through the Democratic Party. There's some who recently are pretty unsuccessful at trying to break through the villainization, a la Nina Turner. But there's also some winners last night that were successful at it. Attacking baseless institutions is difficult, so a figurehead, almost always a woman or person of color, is found to serve as its face. I know that's a convenient scapegoat that these liberals like to use as a shield to try to block valid criticism. But if you know anything about the left, that our criticism is not exclusive to the women or people of color. And that doesn't hold any weight once you excel further left of liberal. Harassment and reputation harm is core to its attack strategy. Institutions often treat reputational harm and online attacks as a personnel matter, one that unlucky employees should simply endure quiet. There is a laziness element that you could point out here, but we on the left do it on merits and based on actions. That is the first focus. We may throw in those additional snipes and digs, such as the shitty TikToks, but it all stems at the beginning from action. Jankowicz's case is a perfect example of the system at work, said Emerson T. Brookgreen, a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic's Council Digital Forensic Research Lab. They try to define people as single decontextualized moments, Brookings said. In Ian's case, it's a few TikTok videos or one or two comments out of thousands of public appearances. They fixate on these small instances and they define this villain. Do you make that same argument for Nancy Pelosi? Because my refute back to this is when people tell you who they are, believe them. And when those TikTok videos of Nina Jankowicz came out, that revealed to me who she is. And I'm going to believe what she conveyed from those videos. Those were not done in jest or of comedic value. That was a way to try to push your beliefs across. Um, to be honest, I cannot identify a single one WCSN because they can sound honest when they're in the minority, but once you put them in that majority uh, dynamic, like you see now, then you see a lot more uh, cowardice and dishonesty. The worst thing any institution can do in the face of such attacks is remain quiet, several disinformation researchers said. Weird, but there are certain things that, in spite of such attacks, you continue to double down on. And I guess this Nina Jankowicz woman or Nira Tannen weren't worth doubling down and putting anchor on. You never want to be silent because then the people putting out the disinformation own the narrative. What is CSN? I mean CNN, MSNBC, and the other corporate news conglomerates? Because those are examples of disinformation that is allowed to own the narrative while they shut down truth tellers and try to deplatform them and make it harder for them to challenge that disinformation that big tech and corporate media are working to prevent, said Mark Jacobson, assistant dean at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Censorship and Public Affairs, who has researched propaganda, political warfare, and disinformation for over 30 years. You need to have a factual and equally emotional counter narrative. Fact sheet is not a narrative. Oh, what are those talking points that you give to all those news people to spew out on a nightly basis? Sounds like a narrative to me. Not responding with a highly compelling counter narrative or not getting ahead of these campaigns to begin with, Jacobson explained, can give them air of legitimacy. He said he was frustrated by Biden administration's lack of loud and vocal response to what Jankowicz was going through, saying it's an amateur hour is cliche, but it's amateur hour. He said of the administration's inaction. Well, you're not wrong about Biden being amateur hour. I mean, the guy is not in the cognitive state that he was in 10 years ago, and you've decided that leaving him behind the scenes, running a campaign with him effectively in his basement was the answer, and continuing to hide him from public appearances. So, what do you expect him to be other than amateur hour? And not in a good way that helps him. The fallout from the campaign against Jankowicz can be seen in the escalating attacks. Violent threats against her are flourishing online, According to Advanced Democracy, users on the far right social media platforms continue to use misogynistic and bigoted language in posts about Jankowicz, with many users calling for violence. Let's see. What about the left, who's just focusing on calling her, calling out what she stands for? That's the focus here. I mean, you can interpret some of the things as misogynistic as well, because that's what the baseline liberal use of identity politics entails, but focuses on purely action here. In one response to one post on Gab featuring a video of Tucker Carlson discussing Jankowicz, users commented, "Time to kill them all." Another post featuring Carlson's coverage of Jankowicz was shared to a right-wing forum with a caption, "This is to the point where we have to draw the line." Comments said Jankowicz should be greeted with Mr. 12-gauge slugs. An April 30th post on Gab featured a tweet by Representative Lauren Boebert telling her followers, "This is the hill to die on," sparked replies that reply with threats to Jankowicz's life. It'd be easier if we had a group of trained assassins to take a lot of the government's bastards out first. One user wrote, "Just know that I am not condoning for violence, but there are bad concepts and structures within this government which need to be killed." Which, by the way, is the status quo of this capitalist neoliberal hell that we live in right now. It's the structure that needs to be killed. Not the We are not condoning the violence of people here. Just shitty constructs of this American society which have made life torture, a living hell for many of the proletariat here. The irony is that Nina's role was to come up with strategies for the department to counter this type of campaign. Now they've just succumbed to it themselves, said one Hill staffer with knowledge of the situation, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak on the issue. They didn't even fight, they just rolled over. That's very on brand for liberals, because in my opinion, liberals are the weak right-wingers who don't fight for anything. So they always succumb to those to their further right who are a bit more interested in being a semblance of a genuine fighter, because they wouldn't be liberals if they were genuine about fighting for things that were antithetical to fascism. I will admit that my guillotine list is long and growing every day. Agree, Kelly. One of my favorite lines from Rustler's Rhapsody: "Let the old men that start the wars fight the wars, eh? It'll never happen. Biden, Obumba, and the Cheney Bush cabal could wear body cams." Exactly. What we should really have right now is a 2-on-1 handicap match between Putin against Biden and Zelensky. And unfortunately, Biden at this stage of his life is more dead weight in a handicap match than Vince McMahon would ever be. And even Vince McMahon could take a bump in a ring better than at this 70 plus years old than this near 80-year-old Biden. Imagine Joe Biden having to take a bump in a wrestling match with Putin and Zelensky. That would probably there would be people legitimately worried about him if that would be the case. DHS staffers worried that the way Jinkowicz's situation was mishandled could hurt their ability to recruit talent at a time when white nationalist violence is thriving and the midterm elections are approaching. So, how about stopping preventing white nationalist violence from thriving in Ukraine? Because that's what you're helping facilitate right now, Biden administration. We're going to need another Nina down the road, said one DHS staffer who spoke on the condition of anonymity because he was not at liberty to comment. Anyone who takes that position is going to be vulnerable to a disinformation campaign or hack. Bottom line is, even if you elevate a man into that position, they're going to be subject to the same type of criticism from us, just like Nina was. So keep that in mind. And I'm sure the right is going to make their push as well, even though, as I mentioned, their merits of their attacks aren't going to be quite as strong as ours. But the point still stands. And even if you replace Nina with a man, our criticism is still going to exist the same way. And we're still going to be staunchly against the idea. Flat and simple. Oh, that was quite an article. Quite the article. So much irony involved. And the hypocrisy is just bleeding. So bleeding, dripping through these ears with ease. But hold on one moment, and we are about to talk about some of these progressive candidates that just made it through their primaries last night. Okay, we back. So let's start off with John Fetterman. He is the running for Senate in Pennsylvania, and he actually crushed Connor Lamb last night in that primary. First figure I'd like to share from this is this. Here's a shitty guy by the name of Eeyore Higgins. And what this is him sharing an article about how Fetterman will lean into U.S. Israel relation as center. And he's like, well, this fucking sucks. Aww. Aww. I don't think my Eeyore was as good as I liked, but I know this Eeyore Higgins guy will definitely come up again as a point of topic in the show. So let's go over some of the important points from that article he referenced. It's kind of ironic how John Fetterman looks like he could be an actor in a movie about the Big Show. Well, well, it's the Big Show. It's a big bad show tonight. And it's not going to be a progressive who's going to be pro Palestine like we should have. John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania and Democratic frontrunner in next month's high profile Senate primary, said he was eager to affirm his unwavering commitment to bolstering ties between the United States and Israel in an interview with Jewish Insider on Thursday, emphasizing he'll lean in on such efforts he is elected to the upper chamber this November. Whenever I'm in a situation to be called upon to take up the cause of strengthening and enhancing the security of Israel or deepening our relationship between the United States and Israel, I'm going to lean in, Fetterman declared in his first conversation with the Jewish publication since he launched his campaign more than a year ago. The relationship is a special one that needs to be safeguarded, protected, supported, and nurtured through legislation and all available diplomatic efforts in the region. Unfortunate. And this is supposedly the best that shitty reformists tell us is possible. Well, it's fine because he's for all the progressive policies here in the United States, though. Even if he's shitty on foreign policy, it's fucking fine. No, it's not fucking fine. Gotta be careful there before it gets too close to sounding like a Harold and Kumar impersonation. You know, I hadn't thought about that, but I'm gonna keep rolling with the Big Show references for now. Fetterman 52 has established himself as an outspoken progressive voice, oxymoron because of if you were a true progressive, you would be for Palestine, Somalia, you'd be anti-Ukraine Nazis, you'd be for the right to self-determination, and the United States no longer of interfering in 80 different countries. But these domestic issues are universal health care, income equality, criminal justice reform, and the legislation of recreational marijuana. But until now, the first lieutenant governor had not publicly clarified his views on a range of Middle East foreign policy matters, including Israel, so has become a source of intense intra-party conflict in recent election cycles, as well as a litmus test for sort of far-left activists who have grown increasingly critical of the American support for the Jewish state. That's right, because there's some of us here who actually take foreign policy fucking seriously, and we are not willing to compromise along with these so-called progressive politicians on this shit. And when you hear from real Palestinians who are affected by this shit, they don't care if they happen to be for uh, improving the lives of the American people because their lives aren't going to get any better. But for those of us smart enough to see through this wishy-washy approach here, the hedging, we know that if we aren't fighting for conditions to get better for Palestinians, that they aren't going to get any, they're only going to get worse for us as well. Uh, Pretty much, Kelly. And there's just a few of us there, like, we don't want anything to do with that ass. We'd rather have the freedom to not have our asses up some other oppressors or stuck between multiple oppressors at once. We'd rather have liberated ass. With just over a month remaining until the May 17th primary, Fetterman's long silence on such matters have fueled curiosity among Jewish leaders in the Commonwealth who have wondered where, if at all, he might place himself in this debate. He's never come out and said he's not a supporter of Israel, but the perception is that he aligns with the squad more than anything else. And before you think of the squad as a pro-Palestine fighting machine, just remember last year when AOC voted present for the Iron Dome. So that meant the squad coordinated their votes to allow additional funding to Israel's Iron Dome to pass. They are not a real anti-Israel, pro-Palestine. If you allow yourself to always have your votes coordinated for the duopoly to get the shit that they want passed. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, another quote. I would also respectfully say I'm not really a progressive in that sense, he added. Our campaign is based on core democratic values and principles and always has been. And there's no daylight between myself and these kind of wavering commitments to Israel's security. So, to me, this sounds like John Fetterman's just another Ro Khanna type where you think that he sounds progressive domestically, but what he is someone who pretty much goes along with the establishment narrative on all their shitty garbage foreign policy agenda that they want done. That's a good question, Kelly, because we've seen uh, Israelis looting the Palestinian houses during the journalist funeral procession. That same one where uh, those fucking cops attacked the people that were holding the tomb. Then also don't forget the Israeli settler colonizers who go through Palestine and kick people out of their homes. Are you sure that you want to defend people who try to hurt the livelihood of others? Much like in the same way that the United States does, but they do it in a kinder, gentler form, at least for aesthetically, a more aesthetically pleasing form for the liberals, so to speak. Oh, this is bad, bad. Israel has the supreme right to defend itself, especially when there are thousands of rockets being indiscriminately fired at innocent citizens, he argued. I believe that the vote was misguided, and that is something I would never be part of. Weird, you have an absolutely batshit fucking backwards interpretation of what's going on between Israel and Palestine right now because that that first word should read Palestine has the supreme right to defend itself when there are thousands of rockets being indiscriminately fired at innocent citizens because it is Israel who is of the main and strong, over the top, obnoxious offender in the situation. And they also do not have any places, they don't have any limits. They'll do it in their places of worship, and that's sick. And this last part here says He's big in his opposition in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So at least he is telling us the truth of where he stands, because I feel like with Jamal Bowman, for example, we couldn't really. He had a hard. He didn't either. Many of us ignored the signs a bit too much. I admit that I may have ignored some of the warning signs with Jamal Bowman, like the let that Obama endorsement slide, but he waited until he won the election to reveal himself for being a anti-BDS type. Just, but at least John Fetterman is doing it a few months before that Senate race that he's going to be in, and he's in a, and I believe that area's that Senate race that he's running in, that's becoming more blue than when Connor Lamb won that seat. So there you go. I think that he probably has a decent shot of winning that. And that he's just going to be another Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey type of progressive, which pretty much doesn't amount to anything worthwhile when it's all said and done in the grand scheme of things. That's really what we all want, Kelly. We are fully in on the concept of BDSU. They'll really need a Seinfeld type to get killed by, quote, Palestinians, while some sort of vacation to get the Western world on their side. Yes, they're always looking to frame anything to push that Zionist agenda. Then the fact, in addition to that, continuing that poorly applied anti Semitism smear that they'll throw around to defenders of Palestine, even though Palestinians are Semitic people. Nice. I think that WCSN, you uh, probably write some good storylines and scripts for like shows and stuff. Uh, let's hear how the Rational National interprets this article. Let's find out what his response was. Worth mentioning, Fetterman came out as extremely pro-Israel a month before the vote, meaning the same money that was spent against other progressives was not spent against him. Here's where I'm gonna. The problem with this. This is where I know that David Dole is going to take this into. It's strategy. It's good strategy to make sure that you pretend you come out as pro-Israel to avoid the pro-Israel money being flooded against you in even a stronger manner than what it was. And Nina, we noticed that Nina Turner tried to hedge on this because she knew that she could not overcome the dark money of pro-Israel. But that's completely on her and her subpar campaign that she ran. But with the way that you know that these types like David Dole, uh, Mike Figueredo, the Eeyore Higgins types of the world interpreted it. Oh, this is just a strategical concession that you have to make in order to win elections. When we know that's a major fallacy to believe in and advocate for. because name one time that a Democratic candidate is going to pretend to be pro-Israel, but once they get into office, they're going to flip and suddenly become a staunch advocate for Palestinians. Let me think about that one. How about fucking never? Not as long as this system is in place. Once you start to take this rhetorical position, especially bad rhetorical positions like this, man, you're always going to be stuck in this. Always. And this is why this whole concept of reforming the Democratic Party is such a unfruitful endeavor. If you have to compromise so many of the important aspects of this to us, the liberation of people here and abroad. And if you think that throwing Palestinians under the bus is going to be a further accomplishment of your goal, then count me the fuck out on that. But next, we got to shift gears. I will do one thing that will be uh, less negative on John Fetterman for a moment. But just one thing. Okay, let's. I hate when I lose the tab. Oh, there it is. Let's get this video up. It's of Chris Wallace saying John Fetterman is vulnerable to Republican attacks in the general election because he's for universal background checks and wants to legalize pot. And I'm about to tell you why this is off base, but let's play the video.
I will say I have to disagree slightly with the previous panel, because while his authenticity and down to earthness, if there's such a phrase, played very well in the Democratic primary, you get to a general election, particularly if you end up with a moderate like Dave McCormick, there are a lot of things that the Republicans are going to have to work with in going after John Fetterman. This is a guy who is against limits on abortion. He is for universal background checks. He wants to end the filibuster. He wants to legalize pot. I will say I have to disagree slightly with the previous panel, because while his authenticity and down to earthness, if there's such a phrase, played very well in the Democratic primary, you get to a general election, particularly if you end up with a moderate like Dave McCormick, there are a lot of things that the Republicans are going to have to work with in going after John Fetterman. This is a guy who is against limits on abortion. He is for universal background checks. He wants to end the filibuster. He wants to legalize pot.
Hey, you know what's what's weird about that is the fact that actually a high amount of Republicans support the ideas of 60% of Pennsylvania support legal pot, 90% support background checks, and I'm sure that like legal pot is pretty favorable even when you go to Republicans as a whole. So, but what's really going to happen is, even though as much as he's telling you that he's pro Israel, that he's really going to end up being smeared for being anti Israel. So that once again takes us back to the point of, even though you might as well take the true opposition point against the right and stand for it, as opposed to trying to be for the same thing or close to the same thing and being smeared as being against the same thing. Oh, I didn't pay attention to that, Kelly, but yeah, well, I think that's pretty irrelevant anyway because she's never gonna be the 51st vote or put that at stake at any time or matter. Doesn't pro Israel essentially mean anti American? Our dual citizen reps that are the takers by far take more and more. Israel gets 80% of our entire foreign aid and budget. I do like the way I do understand the way you're framing this, WCSN, but you know, Israel is probably what it means to be really American, as sad as it is to say. They're so pro American that Americans are pro Israel, so it's kind of like a sad equalization. America equals Israel pretty much at the end of the day. So next, I'm gonna play the David Sirota video, one of the David Sirota videos that he had talked about Fetterman's election victory, primary victory last night. So I'm gonna play this kayfabe real quick for you, and I'm gonna go get some water while I play that. Okay, there it is.
Fetterman is a guy who had run for Senate before. He actually ran in a primary to defeat an incumbent and win the lieutenant governor's slot a few years back. He is a progressive candidate. He is run as kind of an anti-establishment candidate. And I should have mentioned before, a couple of these candidates portrayed themselves on the campaign trail as kind of the opposite of Joe Manchin. And that includes John Fetterman. So John Fetterman running as the opposite of Joe Manchin in a state that neighbors West Virginia, and then winning that contested primary. Again, I think that's a huge thing in that race. And Fetterman won in a race where there were many candidates, and one candidate, Connor Lamb, the incumbent congressman, had gotten backing from a lot of the state's political, Democratic political machinery. Had a super PAC come in for him, a super PAC that the Lever reported had links to the health insurance industry, and Fetterman ended up nonetheless winning that primary. And so again, I think that's a very, very big success for the progressive movement. Fetterman is organized and sort of seen as the progressive candidate. Him being able to win such a high-profile primary, I think, again, against the establishment, that is a significant blow to the Democratic establishment.
Even as he had a stroke and had a pacemaker put in on election day.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's to his credit in the sense of how much organizing and how much grassroots support that he had. And I should add, he made the case throughout the state that the Democrats keep putting up effectively centrist candidates, quote unquote centrists, corporate aligned candidates who have trouble winning working class voters. So Fetterman, it seems, is making an argument that Democrats have to win back the working class, and the way to do it is to make more progressive populist arguments.
I'm just gonna replay the beginning part. That way I can hear the first part of what Sirota said while I was downstairs.
Fetterman is a guy who had run for Senate before. He actually ran in a primary to defeat an incumbent and win the lieutenant governor's slot a few years back. He is a progressive candidate. He is run as kind of an anti-establishment candidate. And I should have mentioned before, a couple of these candidates portrayed themselves on the campaign trail as kind of the opposite of Joe Manchin. And that includes John Fetterman. So John Fetterman running as the opposite of Joe Manchin in a state that neighbors West Virginia, and then winning that contested primary. Again, I think that's a huge thing in that race. And Fetterman won in a race where there were many candidates, and one candidate, Connor Lamb, the incumbent congressman, had gotten backing from a lot of the state's political Democratic political machinery. Had a super PAC come in for him, a super PAC that the Lever reported had links to the health insurance industry, and Fetterman ended up nonetheless winning that primary. And so again,
Yeah, that's right, Kelly. But before I get started on David Sirota and pushing that progressive kayfabe, I'm just going to say that for about 4 years that I lived in his wife's district in the state house, but now I'm back in a different district at the state level. So now I'm back to having a state house representative who's just your standard shitlib in Diana to get. But I I used to vote for Emily, but now I'm probably hardly going to make any votes for candidates, even in certain local races. And now it's time to dive into this kayfabe that David Sirota pushed. And that's the fact that there's still this belief that the establishment doesn't want a guy like John Fetterman to get through. I mean, look at how quickly the whole damn fucking establishment endorsed him after winning the primary last night. This guy is already a captured figure. And you could talk all you want about how his campaign contrasted to that of the people he ran against. But is any of that really relevant anymore now that he's outed himself as having the same shitty foreign policy stances, just like all the other Democrats and Republicans? So this takes me back to that point I was trying to make, how they still smear Republicans will still smear you as being against something even if you're against it too. And that was with the whole because Biden suffered with that whole defund the police thing. It was obvious to us that he was definitely never in 100,000,000 years ever going to be for defund the police. And the fracking argument thing, we knew that he would be pro fracking, even though they tried to say he was anti. But those are just the examples of that point that I was making with the previous video from Chris Wallace. And this is and what David Sirota right here is, he's a sheep herder for the progressive Democrats. And it doesn't matter if you're only selectively sheep herding, because ultimately you're still sheep herding to prop up the rest of that party. The rest of that shitty party is getting more from it than the progressives that you're trying to help get through, Mr. Sirota. And why it's important to point out the truth of where these candidates stand, such as their bad foreign policy positions. That way, people do not get their hopes up anymore on these candidates ever coming in to change the fucking system. But I'm going to go to another video of David Sirota, and this was shared yesterday by Compton J of Revolutionary Blackout Network, as he went in pretty viciously on the whole concept of nihilism and how it's been important to redefine what nihilism is, because what these progressives like Sirota, Jen Perlman, Peter Hager, Nina Turner, Jordan Shared, they're trying to, Sam Cedar as well, pin the argument of nihilism being because we do not want to be in on their efforts to reform the Democratic Party, when the real argument is that nihilism is refusing to try anything else and believing that the only way it could ever be done is through the Democratic Party. They're far more nihilistic by the definition than we are. I also gotta shout out Colin Radix Carter of Indie News Network, because he's also been in on this push to redefine what it means to be nihilistic. So let's get that video up from Compton J. This was from David Sirota doing an interview with Crystal, Kyle, and friends.
Yes, I've had moments where I'm like, you know what, I'm out. Like, I'm done. I hate this. I can't look at it every day. I like it's so nauseating. It's so pointless. And I have those days. And and by the way, I don't begrudge people who say, look, I can't focus on this anymore. It's too depressing. I'm not saying like those people are bad. I get that impulse. But I also think like, and by the way, I also think like just saying, oh, they're all corrupt. Nothing good can possibly happen. And anybody who's trying to work in that system, you must be corrupt or at least stupid by trying to fix things, because the whole system is corrupt. Sort of the black pill idea. Like, there's a blue.
I mean, come on, David. Have we been given any indication, any reason to have real hope that, because you made arguments out of both sides of your ass for Force the Vote last year, because you would make pretty good pro-force arguments on Twitter, but once you went to verbal interviews, you were conceding to anti-force the vote arguments. I mean, is that your form of nuance? Because I think it's important to get this term out into the airwaves when it comes to nuance. Because to me, nuance is just a term for people like the progressives, like that Beverly Hills pedophile, who complain about lack of nuance because you're not making enough concessions to your right. That's what nuance has really become these days. Nuance isn't what it's supposed to be. It's like trying to analyze things from all angles. Because when it comes to people like this, it's really just been bastardized into a term of people who are mad that you're not making the same type of concessions that they're willing to make. And these, and not being willing to call all these people corrupt. And even if you're being generous, the fraud squad are all corrupt by inaction, by cowardice. Tell me how I'm not giving enough nuance. Because if nuance means that I'm not conceding enough in my conviction of where I stand, then I'm not going to be nuanced whatsoever. But if nuance means giving as much of a broad scope of all the angles and intricacies of these issues, then that's the type of nuance I'm for. But not this nuance bastardized definition where it's just you're not conceding enough in your points or your beliefs. You're not willing to compromise like all these progressive politicians are willing to compromise on Palestinians or Venezuelans, for example, another uh, issue that they're really bad on in terms of foreign policy.
Blue pill, the red pill, and the black. Like, I reject that too. Like, you're not smarter by just walking away. Like, you're not better than people by walking away. And by the way, you're not better than people by saying, anybody who's ever voted for a Democrat is supporting the duopoly. Like, here's the thing: the Democratic Party is super corrupt. But
Here's that lightening of the language there again. You're willing to say the Democratic Party is super corrupt, but at the same time, you're going to go out on a limb and say that they're not all corrupt. Then this whole idea of trying to call people who aren't for this uh, reforming of the Democratic Party big brained and smart and big egoed when, I mean, we've seen enough evidence to know that this shit just isn't going to work. And that's the honest and fullest truth of what is happening here. And the fact that we still are being told that we're wrong for it. I mean, I don't think any of us here are really trying to say that the push for direct action and mutual aid is any more of a sure thing than trying to go through the fruitless endeavor of reforming the Democratic Party. But we do know is trying something different is better than continuing to do the worst thing that you could possibly do in this given moment of time and hoping that you can get different results. Remember, the scientific isn't the definition of insanity trying to repeat the same experiment over and over and hoping for different results? That's pretty much what y'all are trying to do with this shit, David.
in the short term, right, in the context, for instance, of the reconciliation bill, all you have right now is a Democratic Party and a Republican Party in Congress. Like you've got to try to get, like, there's a climate crisis happening. It's a ticking time bomb. Like, you have to try to get this horrible, corrupt system to try to do the right thing, stipulating that it is horrible, it's corrupt, the game is rigged. All of that stuff is stipulated, but like walking away from it or just sort of rolling your eyes and saying anybody who's even trying to participate in it is stupid, dumb, and or complicit. Like, I just reject that. Like, there's
Sounds like you're making an argument for direct action, Dave. That's what I feel is the argument you should be making because when you have this system that is unmovable as the way that you are kind of willing to describe, why would we try to continue to move an immovable object in the same way that we've been trying to move it for uh, 60, 40 years, when what we should be doing is trying to use a different strategy? I mean, if you're not going to be able to use the uppercut, why wouldn't we start to work in jabs and hooks if this fighter that you're going against is more susceptible to that type of offense against them? And what uh, we've seen historically in America is most of the achievements that can be considered left are ones that had an element of direct action involved. Exactly, Kelly. That's the point that I'm driving home right now.
too much at stake. It doesn't mean don't hold, progressives accountable, right? Like the squad, the progressive members of Congress, like they need to be held accountable to their promises to hold out.
the corporate Democrats need to be held accountable. But the idea of just rolling your eyes and being like, they're all corrupt. Anybody trying to do any of that is fortifying the evil duopoly. Like, no, there's the other way to look at it is like, yes, the duopoly is pathetic and terrible and corrupt, but it's like what we have in the short term, right in the here and now. We're on a scientific, environmental ticking time bomb time scale here, and like we've got to do anything that we can to make this.
See the irony of that last statement? We gotta try to do anything we can, yet you're pretty much also at the same time telling people that only want to do everything else, that they're wrong for wanting to do anything else that isn't reliant on two-faced politicians, that you hope that they stay true to what they run on a campaign. Sad. This is why we can't really. We'd be a bit further along if we were able to get past the sheep herders like David Sirota, Hassan Piker, Sam Cedar, TYT. Because if an example of if we were a bit past that sheep herding, think about some of these events that we have, like the March for Medicare for All. I think we'd probably be to the point where most of those major cities have a few hundred to 1,000 people showing up, just because I think that's how much of an impact these Democratic Party sheep herders hold when it comes to holding people back from fully immersing themselves in direct action movements. And that's a major problem with David Sirota right here is he's trying to paint these people like us as just the bad type of nihilist when we see what the Democratic Party leads to as socialist alternative member Kashama Sawant says the Democratic Party leads to a graveyard. And that's why Sawant is having success in Seattle, because she's part of the city council, because she didn't try to challenge the federal duopoly. And that's also why she was able to get past a right-wing recall campaign. Think about if Sawant would somehow won a Seattle Senate seat as a socialist alternative candidate, and she was part of the Senate. Think about how much more likelihood that a right-wing recall campaign would have worked on her as a socialist alternative candidate at the federal level. So that's why we gotta call out the bullshit of this fruitless endeavor of trying to reform the Democratic Party, because also gotta touch in on the whole. We haven't really mentioned the third party thing much, but even though I do hold healthy skepticism towards it, third party, as I've said in the past, doesn't really have to win. It just has to get enough voters consistently enough to pull the Democratic Party further left. And I also say this in mind that we would have to stay committed as voters if that type of idea were to work, because there's a bit of a naive thing that, just have 10-15% of us vote one election, then the next one they'll start to get shit done for us. And that's not how it'll work. It works because if it were to ever work, it would be because we would constantly hold the Democratic Party's feet to the fire. And they would have to win by such an uncomfortable margin that they would have to continue to fear losing in order to follow through on anything for the left. So that's that's where my skepticism has to kick in to throw that point into it as well. In Oregon, we're supposed to be able to follow our votes by your ballot serial number, which never came to pass. It was supposed to be active before the 2020 primary. I know that your state, Oregon, WCSN, has some of the more notable progressive reforms and ballot measures, pretty similar to here in Colorado. So, hopefully, something good comes along in our upcoming primaries and midterms down ballot that will be good for us to advocate for, to at least vote on that. So, lastly, on Fetterman, it is a big bad show and not the one that's going to be good for us on the left. But another candidate who won last night was, in their primary, was Charles Booker. And I'll admit that Charles Booker was the last progressive who really got me hyped. I mean, he was catching fire during the George Floyd protest. From the hood to the holler, he had some really good speeches and campaign videos, but just think about how much worse he would have lost that primary to Amy McGrath if he didn't have that George Floyd protest to capitalize the energy off of. As you see here, he won this primary by a landslide, 73.25% to 10.59. And the reason why it's important to point out is Charles Booker has made a change. He started to slowly conform more to the Democratic Party, less of this anti-establishment figure. And I think the first sign of that was he was supposed to be a speaker at the March for Medicare for All event in Kentucky last year, but then he had to come up with an excuse to back out of the events. And I think if you're wanting to have the energy of the left on your side, you at least got to be able to try to pretend to keep the activist with you until you get to office, and then you can stab the activist in the back. But no, he decided to say something else that came up, because we know that he gotten pressured by that whole speaker thing that came up with that neo-Nazi type speaker that the March for Medicare for All organizers quickly fixed within a few hours. But then you had all these fucking DSA types who were throwing a fit about it, just like the PSYOP tactics that Nick Cruz of Revolutionary Blackout Network pointed out to make a big issue over small things or irrelevant things that have already been fucking fixed. And then the hypocrisy of a DSA, which tried to elect a fucking cop into leadership, and that took a few months to resolve, and they want to bitch about something that only took a few hours to fix. And I know that thing was a part of a establishment pressure campaign that led to Booker backing the fuck out of that event. And I think that was a moment where you saw him lack the conviction to tie himself to activist. And since then, you've seen his language get watered down, especially when it came to like health care. And that's why this victory doesn't hit the same as it would have used to back when I used to have a bit more of a belief towards the idea of reforming the Democratic Party. But that left and gone the moment that we saw that force the vote wasn't going to happen. We saw that these were tools, useful tools that were just there to help prop up the shitty establishment known as the Democratic Party. They've been some of the biggest advocates of the piss poor Biden agenda, which gets thrown under the bus by the people that are supposed to be more for it. Oh, then another thing is Charles Booker is now going to be in the race against Rand Paul. So think about, I'm going to look forward to that. One part of the debate that I really hope happens is foreign policy. Because if somehow these two guys never get into a major foreign policy discussion, that'll be upsetting because think about it. Rand Paul right now is the most ardent opposer of sending more money to Ukraine. And the shitlibs are already turning Charles Booker into a pro-Ukraine Democrat. So imagine him having to make a pro-Ukraine argument in an upcoming debate before that Senate race. And we know that Charles is also probably going to make sure that it's known that he's anti-BDS and pro-Israel. So you know he's going to make all the classic concessions that just these so-called moderate Democrats are going to make as well. At least on foreign policy, while still keeping a few of a bit more of the progressive aesthetic in the process. So the reason why it's important to do this is I'm telling you to know to be disappointed by Charles Booker now before if he were to somehow step into office next January. There's one more candidate that I don't really know anything about, but her name's Summer Lee. So I figure at least shine a bit of a spotlight on her. She's also in Pennsylvania in the House. So let's hear a play of clip that I see from her in the search real quick. Yeah, that's a good point because I could see foreign policy not being discussed at all. And that would be really disappointing given how Rand Paul is one of the only unique foreign policy voices, even if we don't agree with all of his takes per se. But this right here is another progressive that wants Summer Lee. And this is, I'll just play this quick clip from her.
Say that we can't, that if we won here in Western Pennsylvania, they would never be able to say that we can't win on a battle for poor working class people. That we can't say that we can't win on clean air and clean water. That we can't win on Medicare for everybody. That we can't win on a quality education for every single child. They can't say that black women can't win. Period. We showed them today. We showed them throughout grace. And I just have such a gratitude to you all. We got a lot of work to do. This was needed.
You know, that actually sounded pretty inspiring from her. At least that was far better than Nina Turner being like, I'm going to be like LeBron and take my talents to a higher office and run for president. Because that was to uh, paraphrase one of the most cringeworthy moments of LeBron James' career in your concession speech. That's pretty freaking sad. But at least Summer had a pretty good, inspiring speech here. But just to let y'all know, the one of the main important hot button foreign policy issues, which is Israel Palestine. Guess where she stands? She's anti BDS as well. So even when you have these candidates who do not fall into as many of the bad rhetorical traps like a Nina Turner did, that they're still gonna have the same bad foreign policy takes in. And it's also important to point out that, last but not least, that even though there's far too little people who prioritize foreign policy into their voting, they are a group of people that matter in this country. And I do appreciate the efforts of a lot of the leftists of color here for making it emphasize how important foreign policy is. Also, all the quality foreign policy reporters that we have in this media space for assisting in pointing out the foreign policy takes and debunking the state narratives. I had another thing planned, but I'm getting damn near 2 hours into this, so I'm just going to go to my final thing of the night. I know that I had Mark Cuban up on the thumbnail, but I'm actually going to skip that story and just go over to the next one. So I've been working in a lot more wrestling references on tonight's show, and coincidentally, I got a nice little wrestling story to close out tonight's show with. And this one is so Monday Night Raw, Sasha Banks and Naomi, who were the current Raw Women's Tag Team Champions, they had both walked out from the show, from the TV taping beforehand, and they had turned their belts in and left. So there's the reason why I'm covering this is there are some worker issues at hand here. I'm guessing this isn't of primary interest, even though I can try. This is why I'm going to try to tie it into worker issues. As previously reported, women's tag team champion Sasha Banks, by the way, who is the niece of Snoop Dogg, and Naomi reportedly walked out of Raw due to creative issues with Vince McMahon. Steve Carey of Ringside News noted the following: "We've asked about the current Sasha Banks and Naomi situation. The jury feeling is Banks has far more heat than Naomi. In fact, we are told Naomi is still very popular backstage, and many people feel Naomi was manipulated by Sasha into walking out. We can confirm the big heat on Sasha Banks backstage is legit. In fact, we were told that Sasha is not well liked backstage in WWE. In fact, she has alienated everyone backstage. On the other hand, we were told that Naomi is well liked." During Wrestling Observer Live, Brian Alvarez of F4W Online addressed the matter. "I am literally aware that two people have publicly said anything positive about Sasha. The funny thing is, this is all on Sasha. I haven't heard anything about Naomi. No one has mentioned Naomi. It's all Sasha. Internally, I'm sure Jimmy Uso is sticking up for Naomi and everything like that. Sure, someone internally is going to do whatever, but I have not heard from one person, not one, that is sticking up for Sasha and Naomi. And not only are they not sticking up for both of them, but boy, have I heard a lot of terms thrown around. Most of them are derivative, mark, effing mark, a mark to a degree that is unfathomable. I've heard zero support for Sasha Banks in this situation. So quite frankly, if you want, you could get mad at me if you want. I've been a lot nicer on this show than everything I've heard from people in WWE over the last 24 hours. Hey, if you want to come after me, then go for it. Zero support. I'm talking zero. It's funny because I haven't heard anyone say anything about Naomi, and she walked out too. It's all about Sasha. I've heard it all. Mark, Diva, the list goes on and on. There's zero support for Sasha Banks walking out of WWE over all of this. People are furious. They think it's ridiculous. They think she's whatever. So that's a story. Wherever this goes, I don't know. But literally every single bit of support I've seen for Sasha Banks coming out of this has been from people in another country that weren't there last night, and that's it. Or fans. Her actual co-workers have zero sympathy for what happened to her. I think that's should probably tell you something again. We have largely heard the official WWE side of the story, but I've heard a lot of people previously off the record, WWE, and they are not sympathetic to this at all. There are people who have presented with really stupid ideas and they've had to do them. They are not sympathetic on this one. I think this kind of tells you she didn't like some creative, but other wrestlers probably looked at creative and thought, dude, what are you complaining about? Both of you are going to be headlining pay-per-view and singles championship matches. This is your job. Yeah, as that quote pretty much said, that Sasha had some issues with creative over the direction of where she was being booked. Yes, I just answered that real quick, Kelly. For those who aren't familiar with wrestling, all these characters are booked by a booker, and in this situation, Vince McMahon controls the book. And even though they're kind of getting pushed, I guess there was some aspect of the storyline they weren't which they weren't happy about. But Sasha Banks right here is getting scapegoated as the one to take all the blame, while Naomi in this situation is not getting the same amount of flack. So where I'm going to go with this story is in the wrestling world, there are all independent contractors. So even though they're independent contractors and they have to negotiate the terms of their whole contract, it's the fact that the inconsistency of this. You're such an individual in so many aspects of in the wrestling business, but in certain instances, you're also expected to be a team player as well. But there's a lot of inconsistency with that because whenever wrestlers in WWE in the past have tried to push for unionization, they have been either ostracized or pretty much treated as a fringe lunatic type, or they have been eventually kicked out or shortly left the company just after. Um, I think wrestlers do have agents for certain things, but I feel like you're mainly acting. You're pretty much challenging up for your own thing. Uh, uh, it's too soon to know because the other main wrestling companies are all elite. TNA, Ring of Honor, New Japan, just to name a few of the other top wrestling companies that are below WWE. But the thing is, you're independent contractors, but at the same time, if you try to, you may not even be able to get your own endorsements or try to line up like an acting role if it conflicts with your WWE schedule. So that means you pretty much have to make the WWE your first and true priority, especially if you're not this established main eventer who has put in their time and that you're a mid-carder, that you're pretty much likely to be stuck making the WWE your first true and only priority. But this is actually a complicated situation, as I've said, that even though there is a respect for the business aspect that is big, but at the same time, when are you at wrestlers at the same time also have selectively respected people who look out for themselves? So there's a big level of inconsistency here that certain people are targeted for being called a diva for looking out for themselves, but there's certain other wrestlers who uh, have put up with some bad booking, but they get the backing whenever they decide to make the choice to look out for themselves. So there's a major level of inconsistency here, and the wrestling business should be a one where there is unionization, a collective bargaining agreement, so to speak. But when it comes down to it, when you look at some of these wrestler contracts, many of these wrestlers are not making the type of money you think they are. Then, when you look at many of the contracts and some of the things that the lower level contracts have, you're going to be surprised at how little that gets covered. Some of these lower level wrestlers still have to cover their flight and room whenever they travel on the road. So there's a so I think the one point I want to make with the story, instead of making it about me trying to stand up for Sasha, is making it about the inconsistencies here, about how even if Sasha is in the wrong here, that this could be a moment where the wrestling business could stand up for better collective working conditions. But instead, uh, with the way the stance is being conveyed as, they're pretty much going to be stuck in the same status quo of where only a few of the top main event level talents are going to be able to thrive, while the mid carders are pretty much stuck in a situation a lot like the working classes, where you may be okay, but you could be far more better. Oh, I don't. It's been a while since I watched Futurama WCSN, so I think I vaguely remember the episode that you're referring to on that. But with that being said, we have come to the end of tonight's episode of the Rochford Files, hosted by Andrew Rochford. Please share. Please like this tweet. Try to share it to someone you haven't shared it to yet. Also, please subscribe on other platforms such as Twitch, Rumble, Odyssey. Then, one last thing is on Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. My guest will be Glory Jones of MCSC Network. So that'll be a fun stream. We'll talk about stuff like Somalia. That'll be one of the big things. Yes, thank you so much, Kelly. No show tomorrow night because it'll be on Friday night instead, but I gave you a bonus one anyway because there is a lot of extra stuff to cover. So have a good night, WCSN, Kelly, and everyone else who eventually views the stream later on. This is Andrew Rochford saying goodbye and good night.